So welcome back, everybody. Mike here once again, bringing to you a lecture on the concept slash chapter entitled Governmentality. So right off the bat, I'm going to let you guys know that there are two translations you'll probably get in class, or one or the other, I mean. One of them is from the book The Foucault Effect, and the other one is pulled right from his one of his lecture books. Now, the Foucault Effect is a translation of a translation into English, while the lecture is from French to English. So, importantly here, I don't speak French, so I can't tell you which one is better, but I will say that both versions do have their own strengths. Personally, I would say if I was giving this to a first time reader, I would probably use the lecture version because I think there are a couple features in there that make the text look easier to read, or it's prettier, or the paragraph breaks are better, or something. But more than likely, you might be assigned the Foucault Effect translation. Either one is fine. Personally, I couldn't decide which one to base this lecture off of, so me being the goddamn overachiever that I am, I ended up just reading both versions side by side and basing this lecture on kind of an amalgamation of my interpretation of both of them. You don't have to read both, it'll still make sense. Ultimately, I'm giving you yet another translation of governmentality into regular human language or whatever. Okay, right into it. So, Foucault begins tracking this new mass of literature that starts coming up from the 16th to around the 18th hundreds, or 16th to 18th centuries. He says this is not exactly political science, but also not exactly advice to the prince. So, nevertheless, a lot of this literature is at least implicitly a response to Machiavelli's The Prince. Now, if you're like me and you're reading this thinking, okay, I want to know what the hell governmentality is, well, you got to be really patient because he never just gives you the answer. Instead of just saying governmentality is XYZ, he tells you what governmentality is by recounting the history of how governmentality came into being. So by the end of the chapter, you know what governmentality is, basically in relation to what sovereign power is and what disciplinary power is. Not to say that they're separable, because you shouldn't separate them, but what it is, governmentality, what it is found exactly in the story of how it emerges. Now, Foucault is gonna read a whole lot of the literature at the time and find the way words and concepts overlap in those discourses or those conversations and debates at the time. So right away, a couple of these words and concepts that he pays special attention to is the word govern, to govern, and the word governor, which is not the same thing. Now, at that time, Foucault notes that the idea of governing was mixed with the idea of governing households and governing children or religious orders. But most importantly, governing was very strongly related to the family. So there are all these multiple types of governing, or like mini governments, if you want to call them that are working under another type of like master government, or the prince's government. Now, what's important here is that theories of sovereign power, or prince's power, the earlier writers tended to postulate this very strong break that separates the prince's government from all other kinds of governments, or mini governments, or all other kinds of governing. The interest before, when we were talking about sovereign power and the prince's power, Um, the interest before was about controlling territories and the prince's subjects. But writers also started wondering about the actual nature, the existence, and the rationalities of what goes into governing, what goes into creating a state. So it's not just about the prince should do this or should not do this, force his power over here, use his leverage over here. Um, it doesn't just assume that the prince and the principality is like put there by God or put there by this like divine essence. It starts noticing how uh, complicated governing is. So these newer writers who were interested in theorizing the new art of government did not have this super harsh break between the prince's version of governing and all the other forms of governing. Now, as you read, you notice that the act of governing begins complexifying, begins dispersing into more and more and more areas of society. Now, notice in this new way of writing, in these new discourses that are emerging, the prince is no longer just interested in Machiavelli's idea of ruling, which was essentially let's manipulate force relations, let's secure territories, let's increase our power over our subjects. It's not necessarily focused so much on that. The art of governing, or the theorization behind the art of governing, starts paying attention to another really important element, or mini government, that already exists under the prince. It's the government of the family, which at the time was called economy. Economy. Now, don't get confused with the modern ideas of economy, because we're not there yet. Also with the word police, we're not there yet either. He's not using modern versions of these ideas, unless he says he is. So try not to get confused there. So this newer art of government, the literature, would begin asking how might we start incorporating this economy model, this model of the family, as potentially a model for state government. Because if you think about it, the family model, there's specific techniques to govern a family, where the father, this central figure, has to manage individuals, has to manage wealth, creating alliances between families, etc., etc. So the question started to become, how can we use the economy model to theorize the government of the state, where the state can supervise and control the conduct of citizens, kind of like the way the father might be imagined to control the conduct of his family. So more things are becoming part of what need to be governed. The word things is in the text, page 92, 93 in the Foucault effect, page 98 in the lectures. Okay, so these things, what else is included in these things? You have families, you have the individuals in the family, you have wealth. Later you have stuff like health, you have mechanisms for lending money, for responses to like fires and floods and natural disasters. I mean, the list goes on. There's a lot of things that now are imagined to be part of what goes into governing a society. Now, before, the idea of the common good was believing that the sovereign was divine and had the common good at heart, because he was put there by God. So to create a good society just required people to follow laws, to submit to the will of the sovereign, which would then reproduce the power of the sovereign. The sovereign would get more powerful, which is a good thing because remember, the sovereign's already good because he was put there by God in the first place. So this circle just keeps going, That was the purpose and the end. Purpose and the end result of what sovereign laws and sovereign power does. On the other hand, this new art of governing was less interested in this reinforcing and expanding the power of the prince, and instead it's starting to ponder on ways to reinforce the notion of the state itself. And these new ideas of what should be governed by the state included more things, which require the king to be involved in arranging those things that is beneficial to society. These things were too complicated to be controlled just by laws. So the government needed to develop tactics to arrange these things. We need to arrange these things to create particular circumstances, to create particular conditions that would hopefully be beneficial to society. So instead of governing by laws only, the art of governing requires more complex mechanisms. So you start noticing in the literature of the literature theorizing governing, this starts to focus on what makes the best kind of government. So there's this subtle shift from thinking about governing as all about violent force and manipulating force relations and like controlling territories, and it starts changing into this more and more detailed form of management and strategies and tactics. And theories start thinking about not just keeping the sovereign in power, but it starts thinking about the best way to manage people and things, which would ultimately uphold the common good. So what's important to remember here is that theorists in this moment that Foucault is talking about, we're not just thinking about the sovereign power or the sovereign form of governing, but they were starting to theorize a newer art of governing. So what's that gonna look like? And here's where we pause, and you're gonna come back to the next video, so I will see you very soon. This is where it starts getting good. See you in a couple seconds.